Tang poetry refers to poetry written in or around the time of or in the characteristic style of China's Tang dynasty, and or follows a certain style, often considered as the golden age of Chinese poetry. The Quantangshi includes over 48,900 poems written by over 2,200 authors. During the Tang dynasty, poetry continued to be an important part of social life at all levels of society. Scholars were required to master poetry for the civil service exams, but the art was theoretically available to everyone. This led to a large record of poetry and poets, a partial record of which survives today. Two of the most famous poets of the period were Li Bai and Du Fu. Tang poetry has had an ongoing influence on world literature and modern and quasi-modern poetry. Periodization. The periodization scheme employed in this article is the one detailed by the Ming Dynasty scholar Gao Ping in the preface to his work Tangshi, Pinwei, which has enjoyed broad acceptance since his time. This system, which unambiguously treats poetry composed during the reign of Emperor Shanzong as being superior in quality to what came before and after, is subjective and evaluative, and often does not reflect the realities of literary history. Forms. The representative form of poetry composed during the Tang dynasty is the shi. This contrasts to poetry composed in the earlier Han dynasty and later Song and Yuan dynasties, which are characterized by fu, ci and qiu forms, respectively. However, the fu continued to be composed during the Tang dynasty, which also saw the beginnings of the rise of the ci form. Within the shi form, there was a preference for pentasyllabic lines, which had been the dominant meter since the 2nd century CE, but heptasyllabic lines began to grow in popularity from the 8th century. The poems generally consisted of multiple rhyming couplets, with no definite limit on the number of lines but a definite preference for multiples of 4 lines. The pre-Tang poetic tradition. The poetic tradition inherited by the Tang poets was immense and diverse. By the time of the Tang dynasty, there was already a continuous Chinese body of poetry dating back for over 1,000 years. Such works as the Chuxi and Shijing were major influences on Tang poetry, as were the developments of Han poetry and Jiunan poetry. All of these influenced the 6 dynasties poetry, which in turn helped to inspire the Tang poets. In terms of influences upon the poetry of the early Tang, Burton Watson characterizes the poetry of the Sui and early Tang as a mere continuation of 6 dynasties' genres and styles. History. The Tang dynasty was a time of major social and probably linguistic upheavals. Thus, the genre may be divided into several major more or less chronological divisions, based on developmental stages or stylistic groupings. It should be remembered that poets may be somewhat arbitrarily assigned to these based on the presumed biographical dates. Furthermore, that the lifetimes of poets toward the beginning or end of this period may overlap with the preceding Sui dynasty of the succeeding 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. The chronology of Tang poetry may be divided into 4 parts: Early Tang, High Tang, Middle Tang, and Late Tang. Early Tang. In Early Tang, poets began to develop the foundation. What is now considered to be the Tang style of poetry inherited a rich and deep literary and poetic tradition, or several traditions. Early Tang poetry is subdivided into early, middle and late phases. Some of the initial poets who began to develop what is considered to be the Tang dynasty's style of poetry were heavily influenced by the court style of the southern dynasties, referring to the southern dynasties of the southern and northern dynasties time period that preceded the short-lived Sui dynasty. The Southern Dynasty court poems tended towards an ornate and flowery style and particular vocabulary, partly passed on through continuity of certain governmental individuals who were also poets. During the transition from Sui to Tang, this group includes the Emperor Li Shimin, the calligrapher Yu Xin and Chu Liang, Li Beilao, the governmental official Shang Guanyi, and his granddaughter, the governmental official and later imperial consort Shangguan Wana. Indeed, there were many others, as this was a culture that placed a great emphasis on literature and poetry, at least for persons in official capacity and the social intimates. Representative of the middle phase of early Tang were the so-called Four Literary Friends, poets Li Jiao, Su Vidao, Cui Rong, and Du Shenyan. This represents a transitional phase. In the late phase, the poetic style becomes more typical of what is considered as Tang poetry. A major influence was Wang Ji upon the four paragons of the early Tang: Wang Bo, Zhang Jiong, Lu Shaolin, and Luo Binwang. They each preferred to dispense with literary pretensions in favor of authenticity. Chen Xiang is credited with being the great poet who finally brought an end to the beginning Tang period, casting away the ornate court style in favor of a hard-hitting, authentic poetry which included political and social commentary, and thus leading the way to the greatness that was to come. High Tang. In High Tang, sometimes known as Flourishing Tang or Golden Tang, first appeared the poets which would come to mind as Tang poets, at least in the United States and Europe. High Tang poetry had numerous schools of thought. The beginning part of this era, or style period, includes Zhang Juling, Wang Han, and Wang Wan. There were also the so-called Four Gentlemen of Wuzhong, He Zhi Zhang, Bao Rong, Zhang Zhu, and Zhang Ru Oxu. The Fields and Gardens poets group include Meng Heiren, the famous poet and painter Wang Wei, Chu Guangxi, Chang Jian, Zhu Yong, Pei Dai, Qiw Yuqian, Qiu Wei, and others. The Borders and Frontier Fortress poets group includes Gao Shi, Sanshen, Zhuang Changling, Wang Zhuan, Cui Hao and Li Qi. Li Bo and Du Fu were the two best-known Tang poets. Li Bo and Du Fu both lived to see the Tang Empire shaken by the catastrophic events of the Inlushan Rebellion. This had a tremendous impact on the poetry, and indeed signified the end of an era. Li Bo and Du Fu would never be forgotten, or cease to be in style. They would both be looked upon as major exemplars, especially Du Fu, by the Song dynasty poets, but the Golden Age was over. Middle Tang. The poets of the Middle Tang period also include many of the best-known names, and they wrote some very famous poems. This was a time of rebuilding and recovery, but also high taxes, official corruption, and lesser greatness. Li Bio's bold seizing of the old forms and turning them to new and contemporary purposes, and Du Fu's development of the formal style of poetry, though hard to equal and perhaps impossible to surpass, nevertheless provided a firm edifice on which the Middle Tang poets could build. In the early phase of the Middle Tang period, Du Fu's Yufu poetry was extended by poets such as Dai Shulan, who used the opportunity to admonish governmental officials as to their duties toward the suffering common folk. Others concentrated on developing the landscape-style poem, such as Lu Changqing and Wei Yinggu. The frontier fortress style had its continued advocates, representative of whom are Li Yi and Lu Luen. The traditional association between poetry and scholarship was shown by the existence of a group of 10 poets, who tended to ignore the woes of the people, preferring to sing and chant the poems in praise of peace, beautiful landscapes and the commendability of seclusion. They are Qianxi. Luoyuan is also a part of this group. Jizhongfu, Hanyi, Sikongshu, Miao Fa or Miaobo, Sui Tong, Genhui, Chiahushen, and the poet Li Duan. One of the greatest Tang poets was Bai Juyi, considered the leader of the somewhat angry, bitter, speaking truth to power New Yufu movement. Among the other poets considered to be part of this movement are Yuanzhen, Zhang Ji, and Wang Jian. Several Tang poets stand out as being too individualistic to really be considered a group, yet sharing a common interest in experimental exploration of the relationship of poetry to words and pushing the limits thereof, including Han Yu, Meng Jiao, Jia Dao, and Lu Tong. Two notable poets were Lu Yuxi and Lu Zongyuan. Another notable poet, the short-lived Li He, has been called the Chinese Mallarmé. Late Tang. In the late Tang, similarly to how eventually the earlier duo of Li Bo and Du Fu came to be known by the combined name of Li Du, so in the twilight of the late Tang there was the duo of the little Li Du, referring to Du Mu and Li Shangyin. These dual pairs have been considered to typify two divergent poetic streams which existed during each of these two times, the flourishing Tang and the late Tang. The late Tang poetry of Du Mu's type tended toward a clear, robust style, often looking back upon the past with sadness, perhaps reflecting the times. The Tang dynasty was falling apart. It was still in existence, but obviously in a state of decline. The poetry of Li Shangyan's type tended towards the sensuously abstract, dense, elusive, and difficult. Other poets of this style were Wen Tingyuan and Duan Changshi. These poets have been gaining interest in modern times. There were also other poets belonging to one or the other of two major schools of the late Tang. In one school were Luo Yin, Nie or Zh.Yi, Yizhong, Du Zunhe, Pyrixu, Lu Gimeng, and others. In the other group were Wei Zhuang, Sikong Tu, Zhanggu, Han Wo, and others. During the final twilight of Tang, both schools were prone to a melancholic angst. They varied by whether they tended towards metaphor and elusiveness or a more clear and direct expression. Yu Shanji was a famous female poet of late Tang. Li He, approximately, was another sometimes famous late Tang poet. Continuation in southern Tang. After the official fall of the Tang dynasty in 907, some members of its ruling House of Li managed to find refuge in the south of China, where the descendants founded the southern Tang dynasty in the year 937. This dynasty continued many of the traditions of the former Great Tang dynasty, including poetry, until its official fall in 975, when its ruler, Li Yu, was taken into captivity. Importantly for the history of poetry, Li survived another 3 years as a prisoner of the Song dynasty, and during this time composed some of his best-known works, thus, including this afterglow of the Tang dynasty. The final date for the Tang poetry era can be considered to be at the death of Li Yu in 978, after the fall of the Tang dynasty. Surviving the turbulent decades of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms era, Tang poetry was perhaps the major influence on the poetry of the Song dynasty. For example, seeing such major poets as Su Shi creating new works based upon matching lines of Du Fu's. This matching style is known from the late Tang. Pyrixu and Lu Gimeng, sometimes known as Pai Lu, were well known for it. One would write a poem with a certain style and rhyme scheme, then the other would reply with a different poem, but matching the style and with the same rhymes. This allows for subtleties which can only be grasped by matching the poems together. Succeeding eras have seen the popularity of various Tang poets wax and wane. The Qing dynasty saw the publication of the massive compilation of the collected Tang poems, the Quantangshi, as well as the less scholarly, but more popular, 300 Tang poems. Furthermore, in the Qing dynasty era, the imperial civil service examinations, the requirement to compose Tang-style poetry was restored. In China, some of the poets, such as Li Bo and Du Fu, have never fallen into obscurity. Others, such as Li Shangyin, have had modern revivals. Anthologies. Many collections of Tang poetry have been made, both during the Tang dynasty and subsequently. In the 1st century of the Tang period, several early collections of contemporary poetry were made, some of which survive and some which do not. These early anthologies reflect the imperial court context of the early Tang poetry. Later anthologies of Tang poetry compiled during the Qing dynasty include both the imperially commissioned Quantangshi and the scholar Sun Ju's own privately compiled 300 Tang poems, part of an anthology by Wiseworm. The zh.Ji, also known as the collection of precious glories, has been found among the Dunhuang manuscripts, consisting of about 1/5 of the original, with 55 poems by 13 men, first published in the reign of Wu Zetian. The book contains poems by Wiseworm, Li Jiao, Zhang Yu, and others. The 300 Tang poems. The most popular Tang poems collection might be the so-called 300 Tang poems compiled by Qing dynasty scholar Sun Ju. It is so popular that many poems in it have been adopted by Chinese language textbooks of China's primary schools and secondary schools. Some of the poems in it are normally regarded as must-recite ones. He said he found the poems in the poetry textbook. Students that had been using poems by 1,000 writers were not carefully selected, but a mixture of Tang dynasty poems and Song dynasty poems written in different styles. He also regarded that some poetry works in that book were not very well written in terms of language skill and rhyme. Therefore, he picked those best and most popular poems from Tang dynasty only and formed this new collection of about 310 poems, including poems by the most renowned poets such as Li Bo and Du Fu. These poems are about various topics including friendship, politics, idyllic life and ladies' life, and so on. Exemplary verse translation into Western languages. Major translators of Tang poetry into English include Herbert Giles, L. Cranmer-Bing, Archie Barnes, Amy Lowell, Arthur Whaley, Witabina A. C. Greg Shigeyoshi Obata, Burton Watson, Gary Snyder, David Hinton, Y. Lim Yip, Red Pine, and Jian Mao. Ezra Pound drew on notes given to him by the widow of Ernest Fenollosa in 1913 to create English poems indirectly through the Japanese, including some Li Bai poems, which were published in his book Cathay. Characteristics. Tang poetry has certain characteristics. Contextually, the fact that the poems were generally intended to be recited in more or less contemporary spoken Chinese and that the poems were written in Chinese characters are certainly important. Also important are the use of certain typical poetic forms, various common themes, and the surrounding social and natural milieu. Relationship to Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. The Tang dynasty time was one of religious ferment, which was reflected in the poetry. Many of the poets were religiously devout. Also, at that time religion tended to have an intimate relation with poetry. Gender studies. There has been some interest in Tang poetry in the field of gender studies. Although most of the poets were men, there were several significant women. Also, many of the men wrote from the viewpoint of a woman, or lovingly of other men, historically and geographically localized in Tang dynasty China. This is an area which has not escaped interest from the perspective of historical gender roles. Cited works: Hoyd, ed. Vanessa Lyde Whitcomb, Michael Benson. The Complete Idiot's Guide to Modern China. Alpha Books. ISBN 0028643860. Jing Schmidt Duo. Dramatized Discourse. The Mandarin-Chinese Bar Construction. John Benjamin's Publishing Company. ISBN 9027215650. Mayer, Victor H. The Columbia History of Chinese Literature. New York, Columbia University Press. ISBN 0231109849. Merck, Alfreda. Poetry and Painting in Song China, The Subtle Art of Dissent. Harvard University Asia Center. ISBN 9780674007826. Watson, Burton. Chinese Lyricism, She Poetry from the 2nd to the 12th Century. New York, Columbia University Press. ISBN 0231034644. Wu, John C.H. The Four Seasons of Tang Poetry. Rutland, Vermont, Charles E. Tuttle. ISBN 9780804801973. Yu, Pauline. Chinese Poetry and Its Institutions. In Xiang Lectures on Chinese Poetry, Volume 2, Grace S. Fong, editor.